The nomarch's ascent, the rise of local warlords, the governors who became kings, the grand tableau of the Old Kingdom, particularly in its flourishing 5th and 6th dynasties, was defined by an almost unimaginable centralization of power. At its apex sat the pharaoh, a living god whose authority radiated outwards from Memphis, controlling every aspect of governance, economy, and religious life. This meticulously ordered system relied on an intricate bureaucracy, a vast network of scribes, officials, and regional administrators who ensured the smooth functioning of the state. Among the most crucial of these administrators were the nomarchs, the provincial governors. For centuries, these individuals were the king's eyes and ears in the nome's provinces, directly appointed by the pharaoh, beholden to his will and responsible for carrying out his decrees, collecting taxes, and maintaining order in their assigned territories. But as Egypt drifted into the twilight of the Old Kingdom and plunged headlong into the First Intermediate Period, the very structure that held the empire together began to fray. The nomarchs, once loyal agents of the king, would slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, transform into independent rulers. Local warlords carving out their own fiefdoms from the disintegrating whole. To truly understand why you wouldn't survive this tumultuous era, it's essential to grasp how these provincial administrators, designed as pillars of royal authority, became the architects of a fractured nation. Imagine yourself as a common farmer in, say, the thin night nome of Upper Egypt. Your ancestors, for generations, had known only the distant, yet absolute authority of the pharaoh. His decrees reached you through a clear chain of command, from the vizier in Memphis, to the nomarch of your province, and finally to your village headman. The nomarch, though powerful locally, was seen as a mere extension of the pharaoh's. Will he oversaw the maintenance of irrigation canals, ensuring water reached your fields. He was responsible for collecting your portion of the harvest as tax, which then flowed up the chain to the royal granaries, theoretically to be redistributed in times of need or used for monumental state projects. He also held court, settling local disputes and ensuring the peace. His loyalty to the pharaoh was paramount, and his position, theoretically, depended entirely on royal favor. However, a subtle yet profound shift began to occur, even during the apparent stability of the later Old Kingdom. The administrative machine, designed for efficiency, became increasingly complex and somewhat unwieldy. The pharaohs, perhaps in an attempt to reward long-serving officials or to better integrate distant provinces, began to grant nomarchs greater control over their local resources. More significantly, the practice of hereditary succession for nomarchs gradually became common. Instead of the pharaoh appointing a new governor for each nome, the position would often pass from father to son. This seemingly minor bureaucratic change had immense implications. A nomarch who inherited his position, rather than being personally chosen by the king, naturally developed a stronger sense of personal ownership over his nome. His loyalty might begin to shift from the abstract concept of a distant pharaoh to the concrete reality of his own family's long-standing connection to the province. The real acceleration of the nomarch's ascent, however, was fueled by the environmental and economic crises we've discussed, the unreliable Nile floods and the ensuing famine. As the central government in Memphis struggled to cope with widespread crop failures and diminishing resources, its ability to provide for the provinces, or even to enforce its will, drastically waned. When the royal granaries in Memphis grew empty, and the pharaoh could no longer send food aid to starving regions, the burden of providing for the populace fell squarely on the shoulders of the local nomarchs. Imagine the dilemma of a nomarch in a drought-stricken province. His people are starving. The usual shipments of grain from the central government are not arriving. He has a choice: watch his people die, or use the remaining local resources, the grain in his own provincial granaries, the labor of his people, to sustain his nome, even if it means defying the pharaoh's usual requisitions. Most, understandably, chose the latter. They began to hoard resources, prioritizing the survival of their own province over the demands of a distant and increasingly ineffective central authority. The grain that once flowed to Memphis now stayed in the nome. The taxes, once destined for the royal treasury, were now collected and spent locally. This control over local resources quickly translated into political and military power. Nomarchs began to raise and maintain their own local militias, originally perhaps for defense against bandits or to manage internal disputes, but increasingly as a means to assert their independence and, if necessary, defend their borders against encroaching neighbors. These militias, composed of their own provincial subjects, were loyal to the nomarch himself, not to the distant pharaoh. This marked a profound shift from a unified royal army to a collection of independent regional forces. Furthermore, nomarchs began to solidify their power through local building projects and the creation of their own distinct administrative centers. They started commissioning their own tombs, not necessarily in the grand style of Saqqara, but within their own nomes, reflecting a newfound independence in their afterlife aspirations. They began to issue their own local decrees, administer their own justice, and essentially act as miniature kings within their provinces. The titles they adopted might still acknowledge the pharaoh, but their actions spoke of growing autonomy. For you, the common person, this decentralization presented both a grim challenge and, paradoxically, a fleeting sense of localized security. On one hand, the old, stable system was gone. You could no longer rely on the overarching protection or provision of the pharaoh. On the other hand, if your nomarch was competent and charismatic, he might be able to provide some immediate relief. Some food, some protection from bandits, even if it was me. Your loyalty, once national, became intensely local. The nomarch was the visible authority, the one who could actually do something, or at least try to do something, to alleviate your suffering. The rise of these powerful nomarchs, initially a pragmatic response to a collapsing state, inexorably led to further fragmentation. As the concept of a single, unified Egypt weakened, the individual nomes began to view each other with suspicion, and soon, with outright hostility. The scramble for dwindling resources, fertile land, remaining water sources, control of trade routes, would inevitably lead to interprovincial conflicts. The governors who had risen to fill the void left by a failing pharaoh were now on a collision course, transforming the land into a patchwork of competing power bases. What would become of Egypt, the land of the unified two lands, when its very foundations were fractured by these ambitious, desperate, and increasingly independent rulers? The battlefields of the breadbasket asterisk as the nomarchs consolidated their power in the dying days of the Old Kingdom. The carefully maintained unity of Egypt shattered. For you, the ordinary Egyptian, this meant that the relative peace and predictable order you once knew was replaced by a landscape of constant threat. The very breadbasket of the ancient world became a battleground, as ambitious local rulers fought over dwindling resources and the remnants of a collapsing empire. Imagine your village, once a quiet agricultural community, now caught between the competing ambitions of two neighboring nomarchs. The old territorial boundaries, once mere lines on a map maintained by the distant pharaoh, now became fiercely contested borders. The irrigation canals, once a shared resource managed for the common good, became strategic assets, controlled by one nomarch to deprive his rival. Water, the very lifeblood of Egypt, became a weapon. The militias raised by the nomarchs were no longer just for defense against bandits. They were instruments of aggression. These weren't professional armies in the modern sense, but often hastily assembled bands of local farmers and laborers, armed with whatever was available: spears, axes, even farm tools. Their training would be minimal, their discipline questionable, and their primary loyalty would be to their local lord, not to any overarching sense of Egyptian identity. The battles between these forces would have been brutal and disruptive. They wouldn't have been grand, decisive campaigns like those depicted in later Egyptian art. Instead, they would have been localized skirmishes, raids, and sieges fought over control of key resources: a fertile stretch of land, a strategic canal, or a fortified village. Your home might be looted, your crops destroyed, and your family forced to flee. The very act of farming, once a predictable cycle, would become a dangerous gamble. Would you risk planting your fields only to have them trampled by warring factions? The nomarchs themselves varied greatly in character and ambition. Some might have been relatively benevolent rulers, focused primarily on protecting their own people and maintaining some semblance of order within their limited domains. Others would have been ruthless opportunists, expanding their territories through force and exploiting the chaos for personal gain. Their motivations would be a mix of genuine concern for their people, naked ambition, and the simple desire to survive in a world where the old rules no longer applied. The pharaoh, still nominally the ruler of Egypt, would have been largely powerless to stop these conflicts. His authority, already weakened by the famine and the rise of the nomarchs, was now a mere shadow. His attempts to mediate or intervene would likely be ignored, or even met with open defiance. The concept of a unified Egypt, ruled by a divine king, was rapidly becoming a distant memory. The economic consequences of this constant warfare were devastating. Trade routes, once vital arteries connecting the various regions of Egypt, would become insecure or completely disrupted. The specialized crafts and industries that had flourished in the Old Kingdom would decline. Who would invest in pottery or weaving when the threat of violence loomed constantly? The focus shifted entirely to immediate survival, to securing enough food and water to make it through the next day. The social fabric of Egyptian society would fray under the strain of constant conflict. The old hierarchies, the respect for tradition, and the sense of shared identity would erode. Loyalty became localized, often based on fear or necessity. The very idea of being Egyptian, of belonging to a unified nation with a shared history and culture, would be challenged by the brutal realities of regional fragmentation. For you, this era would be a constant test of resilience and adaptability. You might have to learn to fight, to defend your home and family. You might have to flee your village, becoming a refugee in your own land. You might have to make alliances with unsavory characters, simply to survive. The once predictable rhythm of Egyptian life, the annual cycle of the Nile, the stability of the pharaoh's rule would be replaced by a chaotic and unpredictable struggle for existence. What happens to a civilization when its very breadbasket becomes a battlefield and its people are forced to choose between starvation and violence? The fractured legacy and the seeds of reunification, asterisk. The relentless conflicts orchestrated by the ascendant nomarchs plunged Egypt into an era of unprecedented fragmentation. For you, the common Egyptian, this chaotic reality meant living in a land where the very idea of a unified nation was a distant, perhaps even mythical, memory. The two lands, once seamlessly bound by the pharaoh, were now a patchwork of independent, often warring, principalities. Yet, out of this profound disunity, the seeds of a future reunification would eventually sprout, born from the very desperation that defined the age. The most enduring legacy of the nomarchs' ascent was the complete collapse of central authority. The pharaoh, reduced to a mere figurehead, might still have held a title in Memphis, but his actual power extended little beyond his palace walls. The national bureaucracy, that intricate web of scribes and officials, disintegrated. Royal works, once the hallmark of a unified state, ceased entirely. This meant that the grand projects, the pyramid complexes, the vast irrigation systems, the coordinated mining expeditions that had defined the Old Kingdom were no longer feasible. The very concept of a national identity centered around the pharaoh weakened significantly, replaced by fierce local loyalties. You would identify primarily with your nome, your local lord, and your immediate community, rather than with a broader Egypt. The nomarchs, now acting as de facto kings, established their own local dynasties. They commissioned their own modest tombs within their nomes, often adorned with texts and art that, while drawing on Old Kingdom traditions, also reflected their newfound independence and regional styles. They continued to collect taxes, administer justice, and maintain their militias. Some nomarchs even began to adopt kingly titles, or to claim a measure of divine right, further eroding the unique status of the pharaoh. However, the constant interprovincial warfare had a devastating toll. While a strong nomarch might offer temporary protection, the overall instability prevented any long-term recovery from the famine. Trade remained disrupted, agriculture precarious, and life unpredictable. The very resources the nomarchs fought over, fertile land and water, were themselves diminished by the ongoing environmental crisis and lack of coordinated maintenance. The populations of many nomes dwindled due to starvation, disease, and conflict. This prolonged suffering and the utter chaos of living under a multitude of warring lords ultimately created a deep longing for stability and a return to the unified state. The memory of the Old Kingdom, perhaps romanticized over generations, represented an age of order and plenty compared to the current anarchy. This collective desire for order would eventually become the driving force behind the reunification of Egypt. Paradoxically, the very strength and independence of the nomarchs also contained the seeds of this reunification. While they were rivals, some nomarchs began to expand their influence beyond their immediate nomes, conquering weaker neighbors and gradually building larger regional power blocks. Two of these blocks, emerging from the regions of Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south, would eventually grow powerful enough to challenge each other for supremacy, ultimately leading to the bloody, drawn-out civil war that would end the First Intermediate Period. The nomarchs' ascent, therefore, marked a dramatic turning point in Egyptian history. It was a period of profound suffering and decentralization, a dark age where the centralized power structure of the Old Kingdom was utterly dismantled. But it also proved that Egyptian civilization, deeply rooted in its land and its cultural identity, possessed an incredible capacity for resilience. The experience of fragmentation and chaos would leave an indelible mark on the future of Egypt, influencing the governance, art, and beliefs of the subsequent Middle Kingdom, which would strive to re-establish unity while subtly acknowledging the enduring power of its diverse regions. The rise of the nomarchs showed that even in the absence of a supreme divine king, the people of Egypt found local leaders who, for better or worse, steered them through one of their civilization's darkest hours. The whispers of Heracleopolis, a new capital, a fading dream, the throne in the north, and a kingdom divided, as the old kingdom dissolved into the chaotic first intermediate period. The dream of a unified Egypt seemed to shatter into countless fragments. Yet, even amidst the widespread famine and the rise of local warlords, a semblance of central authority attempted to re-emerge, clinging to power from a new, less glorious capital, Heracleopolis Magna, located roughly 80 kilometers south of Memphis. For you, a common Egyptian citizen, the very existence of this new pharaonic line in the north was a stark symbol of the fractured world you now inhabited. It represented a desperate attempt to restore order, a fleeting hope that the golden age of unified rule might return, even as the reality on the ground told a far different story. Memphis, the ancient heart of the Old Kingdom, had been a grand symbol of centralized power, but it was too vulnerable to the widespread chaos and the insurrections that had plagued its own streets, as seen in the Memphis riots. Its strategic location, while perfect for controlling the Delta, also made it susceptible to the disruptions emanating from the struggling provinces. The rulers who eventually rose to claim the pharaonic mantle during this turbulent era, largely originating from the 9th and 10th dynasties, chose Heracleopolis as their seat of power. This wasn't a choice driven by grand vision or established tradition, but by necessity and tactical advantage. Heracleopolis offered a more defensible position, strategically located at the Fayoum entrance, allowing some control over the fertile Fayoum oasis and the crucial Nile Valley, yet far enough from the immediate chaos of a besieged Memphis. The pharaohs of Heracleopolis faced an almost insurmountable task. They claimed the ancient titles, the divine right to rule all of Egypt, but their actual authority barely extended beyond the surrounding few nomes of Middle Egypt. Their kingdom was a fractured shadow of the Old Kingdom's vast empire. They were essentially just another, albeit slightly more prestigious, line of nomarchs, desperately trying to assert a claim of national sovereignty where none truly existed. Their court, while aspiring to Memphite grandeur, would have been a far cry from the opulent, well-stocked palaces of Khufu or Pepe II. You, a refugee from a starving village, looking towards Heracleopolis for salvation, would likely find little more than a powerful regional center, struggling with the same resource scarcity that plagued the rest of the land. The primary ambition of these Heracleopolitan pharaohs was to restore order to Lower and Middle Egypt, to consolidate their rule over the Delta and the northern part of the Nile Valley, and to, in theory, reunite the entire land. This required immense effort, primarily military campaigns against rebellious nomarchs, and the maintenance of what little infrastructure they could control. They were effectively fighting a civil war against their own subjects, the very nomarchs who had asserted their independence in the preceding decades. The king in Heracleopolis would send out decrees attempting to re-establish the old systems of taxation and control. But these pronouncements often met with defiance or were simply ignored by powerful regional lords who had grown accustomed to their autonomy. For you, living in a nome nominally under Heracleopolitan rule, life would still be incredibly difficult. The pharaoh's focus was on securing his fragile power, not necessarily on alleviating the widespread famine. While some resources might have been directed to his immediate sphere of influence, the vast majority of the population would still be left to fend for themselves. You would be expected to pay taxes, however meager your harvest, and your labor might be conscripted for local defenses rather than productive agricultural work. The constant threat of military conflict between Heracleopolis and its northern rivals, or between Heracleopolis and the emerging power in the South Thebes, would loom large over your daily existence. The intellectual and cultural life under Heracleopolis also reflected this struggle. While scribes and artisans still existed, their work was focused on the immediate needs of the Heracleopolitan court and its limited elite. There was no vast national patronage for monumental works or elaborate tomb constructions. Funerary texts, like the coffin texts, began to emerge and spread, reflecting a democratization of access to the afterlife, not because of royal benevolence, but because the traditional, pharaoh-centric path to eternity had proven unreliable. These texts, once inscribed primarily on royal tombs, now appeared on the coffins of local officials and even commoners, reflecting a more personal and localized attempt to secure eternal life. This was a direct result of the crumbling Old Kingdom system and the general insecurity, forcing people to find new ways to ensure their spiritual well-being independent of a powerful central pharaoh. The pharaohs of Heracleopolis ruled in a time of profound contradiction. They carried the weight of a unified past, but their present reality was one of division and struggle. Their very existence underscored the depth of the crisis, an acknowledgement that the old capital and the old system had failed. They were kings in name, but warlords in practice, desperate to claw back a semblance of order from the jaws of chaos. Yet, their fragmented reign would set the stage for a new kind of challenge, a growing rivalry with a power far to the south, a power that held a different vision for Egypt's future. What would happen when two competing visions of Egyptian unity, both born from the chaos of the first intermediate period, finally clashed for ultimate control? The struggle for legitimacy and the rising South asterisk, the pharaohs of Heracleopolis, clinging to their tenuous claim to the throne of Egypt, were not just battling the widespread famine and the defiant nomarchs. They were fighting a relentless struggle for legitimacy in a land where divine kingship was paramount. Their very existence in a new, unhallowed capital spoke volumes about the fractured state of the nation. For you, the common Egyptian, this meant that the traditional sources of order and meaning, unified pharaoh, stable governance, and predictable religious rituals were constantly being undermined, leaving you in a spiritual as well as material vacuum. Imagine the psychological impact of seeing the ancient rites of kingship performed in a place that wasn't Memphis or the hallowed burial grounds of Saqqara. The grand processions, the intricate ceremonies meant to reaffirm the pharaoh's divine connection, would have seemed less potent, perhaps even a bit hollow, when performed in a provincial city by a king whose actual reach was so limited that the very sacredness of the pharaoh's role was being diluted, not by a lack of belief, but by the undeniable reality of his diminished power. The Heracleopolitan court, though striving for the grandeur of the Old Kingdom, would have been a shadow of its former self, constantly preoccupied with internal stability rather than outward displays of power. Their attempts to reassert control were often met with brute force. The Heracleopolitan pharaohs engaged in continuous, exhausting military campaigns against the powerful nomarchs who refused to acknowledge their authority. These weren't grand, organized wars with clear objectives. They were often protracted. Sieges of fortified towns, bloody skirmishes over control of vital agricultural land, and punitive raids against rebellious provinces. For the local population, this meant conscription into militias, the destruction of crops, and the pervasive fear of being caught between warring factions. Your village might have been forced to supply soldiers for the Heracleopolitan king one year, only to be raided by a rival nomarch the next. The constant state of low-intensity warfare prevented any widespread recovery from the famine, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and desperation. Beyond the internal struggles, a new and formidable challenge was emerging from the deep south, Thebes. While Heracleopolis sought to restore the old order in the north, a different group of nomarchs in Upper Egypt, particularly those based in Thebes, was slowly but surely consolidating their own power. Initially, these southern rulers might have paid lip service to the Heracleopolitan pharaoh, or simply ignored him. However, as their own resources grew and their control over more southern nomes solidified, they began to present a direct challenge to Heracleopolitan claims of universal rule. The Theban nomarchs, the early rulers of the 11th dynasty, often had a different perspective. Far from the immediate chaos of the Delta, they were able to build a more cohesive power base, fueled by the relatively more stable floods in Upper Egypt and the control of crucial trade routes to Nubia. Their rise wasn't just a political rivalry, it was a burgeoning civil war for the very soul of Egypt. The whispers of Heracleopolis were increasingly drowned out by the growing strength and ambition emanating from Thebes. The prophecy of Nefertiti, a text likely composed during the Middle Kingdom but set in the Old Kingdom, might reflect the anxieties of this period. It speaks of a chaotic time, of a king in a distant land, and of social upheaval, providing a narrative lens through which later Egyptians viewed the first intermediate period. It highlights the widespread despair and the longing for a savior king to restore order, a longing that both Heracleopolis and Thebes would eventually attempt to fulfill, but through very different means. For the Heracleopolitan pharaohs, the rising power of Thebes represented an existential threat. They tried to counter it through military campaigns, but their resources were already stretched thin by controlling their own rebellious northern territories. The long, drawn-out conflict would deplete both sides, further burdening the already suffering populace. You, living in a Heracleopolitan-controlled area, would become acutely aware of the constant threat from the south. Seeing the movement of troops and hearing reports of battles far upstream, the unified north under Heracleopolis was in reality constantly on the defensive, its dream of a restored empire fading with each passing year. The struggle for legitimacy in Heracleopolis was therefore a battle against internal chaos and an external, rapidly expanding rival. Their inability to truly unify even the northern half of Egypt, coupled with the relentless pressure from the south, meant that their claim to universal pharaonic power remained largely a desperate whisper in a land longing for a true, undisputed king. What would be the ultimate cost of this long and bloody standoff between two competing visions of Egyptian unity? The northern sunset and the road to reunification *, the long, drawn-out struggle for legitimacy waged by the pharaohs of Heracleopolis, ultimately ended not with a sudden cataclysm, but with a slow, grinding attrition. For you, the common Egyptian, this meant that life remained a brutal grind, caught between the demands of a struggling northern authority and the relentless expansion of a powerful southern rival. The dream of Heracleopolitan unity, built on a foundation of desperate hope, was destined to fade, paving the way for a reunification that would come from an entirely different direction. The Heracleopolitan kings, despite their efforts, could never truly re-establish the comprehensive centralized control of the Old Kingdom. Their authority remained largely regional, a testament to the deep fragmentation caused by the famine and the rise of independent nomarchs. They might have won battles, but they could not win the peace or truly mend the shattered economic and social fabric of northern Egypt. The famine continued its relentless toll, exacerbated by the constant warfare that disrupted what little agricultural production remained. Trade routes remained insecure, and the flow of resources to the capital remained tenuous. The city of Heracleopolis, while a center of power, was not the vibrant, self-sustaining metropolis that Memphis had been. The decisive factor in the decline of Heracleopolis was the ever-growing strength of Thebes in the south. The Theban, particularly the early rulers of the 11th dynasty like Inteftu and Mentuhotep I, steadily expanded their control over Upper Egypt. They developed a more stable power base, often benefiting from more consistent Nile floods in their southern territories and securing lucrative trade routes with Nubia, which provided gold and other vital resources. Unlike Heracleopolis, which was trying to cling to the remnants of a shattered north, Thebes was building a new, unified state from the ground up in the south. The conflict between Heracleopolis and Thebes escalated into a full-blown civil war, a protracted and bloody struggle that would define the final phase of the First Intermediate Period. The Heracleopolitan pharaohs, despite their historical claim to the throne of Egypt, were increasingly outmatched by the growing military might and organizational prowess of the Thebans. You, living in the northern territories, would have heard constant reports of battles, of shifting front lines along the Nile, and of the relentless southern push. Your region might have been captured and recaptured multiple times, each change of overlord bringing new demands for taxes and forced labor. The eventual fall of Heracleopolis was not a single, dramatic event, but the culmination of this long, exhausting struggle. It was ultimately overshadowed by the decisive victory of the Theban forces under Mentuhotep II, who would finally defeat the last Heracleopolitan pharaoh, likely Mentuhotep III, and reunite Egypt under a single rule. This reunification, marking the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, was a triumph of the South over the North, and a testament to the enduring desire for unity after generations of chaos. The legacy of Heracleopolis, though ending in defeat, is crucial. It represented the first sustained attempt to re-establish a unified Egypt after the Old Kingdom's collapse, even if it was ultimately unsuccessful. Their efforts, however flawed, kept the flame of pharaonic rule alive in a dark age and demonstrated the deep-seated cultural impulse for a unified land. The very fact that a king continued to exist, even with limited power, provided a conceptual bridge between the fragmented past and the unified future. For future pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, the lessons of Heracleopolis would be profound. The crisis of the First Intermediate Period taught them that divine right alone was not enough. A pharaoh also needed to be a capable administrator, a strong military leader, and a guarantor of his people's material well-being. The rise and fall of Heracleopolis underscored the importance of securing resources, controlling the provinces, and maintaining a military capable of defending national unity. The whispers of their fading dream ultimately became a stark warning about the fragility of power and the necessity of true, tangible leadership to bind a fractured land. The long shadow of the First Intermediate Period, born from the failures of the Old Kingdom and the struggles of Heracleopolis, would forever shape the mindset of Egyptian rulers. It instilled a pragmatism, a focus on securing the necessities of life for the populace, and a determination to never again allow Egypt to descend into such a chaotic abyss. The first intermediate periods lost scribes, knowledge fading in the dust asterisk the quill, the papyrus, and the empty stomach asterisk. Imagine being a scribe in ancient Egypt during the golden age of the Old Kingdom. You were part of an elite, respected class, guardians of knowledge, the very backbone of the pharaoh's meticulously organized state. Your daily life revolved around the steady scratch of your reed pen on papyrus, meticulously recording everything from grain harvests and tax revenues to sacred hymns and complex medical treatises. You were well fed, educated, and secure, your skills indispensable to the functioning of a unified empire. But as Egypt descended into the first intermediate period, this world crumbled, and the revered profession of the scribe faced an existential crisis. To understand why you wouldn't survive this era, you must grasp how the very act of writing, the preservation of knowledge, became a casualty of chaos, a luxury that a starving nation could no longer afford. The Old Kingdom's vast administrative machine, the very foundation of its power, was built on documentation. Every aspect of life, from the smallest villages, cattle count, to the grandest pharaoh's genealogy, was recorded. Scribes were trained in specialized schools attached to temples or royal palaces, mastering hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts, mathematics, and even astronomical observations. They were the custodians of Mat, not just through ethical conduct, but by ensuring the precise order of the state through accurate records. Your livelihood, your status, your very identity stemmed from this rigorous intellectual discipline. You understood that knowledge was power, and that your ability to read and write made you a crucial link in the chain of command, a bridge between the divine pharaoh and his earthly domain. However, the onset of the famine and the collapse of central authority struck at the heart of this scribal establishment. Papyrus, though indigenous to Egypt, required a functioning economy to produce, process, and distribute. In a time of scarcity, with trade routes disrupted and resources hoarded by competing nomarchs, this vital writing material would become increasingly rare and expensive. Imagine attempting to do your job when the very paper you write on is unobtainable, or when the inks, made from ground minerals and soot, are impossible to acquire. Your tools, once readily available, would become precious, unreplaceable commodities. The specialized scribal schools would be among the first institutions to suffer. Dependent on royal or temple patronage, they would have seen their funding dry up as resources were diverted to immediate survival or military endeavors. Teachers would be dispersed. Students would be forced to abandon their studies to search for food, and the rigorous multi-year training necessary to become a skilled scribe would simply cease. The tradition of meticulous record-keeping, passed down from master to student for centuries, would be interrupted, its continuity threatened by the exigencies of an empty stomach. For you, a scribe, this meant not just a loss of livelihood, but a loss of identity. Your specialized skills, once highly valued, would become largely irrelevant in a fragmented world where raw survival was the only currency. Who needed a meticulous record of land deeds when bandits roamed freely and property rights were enforced by the strongest arm? Who required complex astronomical calculations when the very predictability of the Nile had been broken? Your very existence, once secure and privileged, would become precarious. The elaborate bureaucracy that had provided employment for thousands of scribes would disintegrate. The tax collection system would collapse. Records of grain storage would become unreliable or non-existent, and the vast national archives would fall into disarray. The carefully ordered administration, which ensured that every resource was accounted for, every decree disseminated, every legal dispute recorded, would simply cease to function. The once clear flow of information from the pharaoh's court to the most distant provinces would become a trickle, then stop altogether, replaced by rumor and word of mouth. Furthermore, the temples, which housed many scribes and vast libraries of religious and administrative texts, would face similar destitution, as their endowments dwindled and their cults struggled to maintain basic rituals. Their role as centers of learning and record-keeping would diminish. The very act of copying sacred texts, once a priestly duty, would become a luxury that fewer and fewer could afford. The knowledge contained within these texts, vital for maintaining religious practice and cultural memory, would become vulnerable to neglect and loss. The first intermediate period, therefore, witnessed not just a material collapse, but an intellectual one. The steady flow of information, the meticulous preservation of history, and the very training of those who could read and write, all vital elements of a complex civilization, were profoundly disrupted. The quill and papyrus, once symbols of enduring order, became relics of a bygone era, silent witnesses to a civilization that was slowly forgetting itself. What would happen to the collective memory of a people when the very guardians of its written word began to disappear into the dust of chaos? The scarcity of script and the rise of oral tradition asterisk as the first intermediate period deepened. The scarcity of resources and the widespread chaos intensified the intellectual decline that had begun with the collapse of the central scribal institutions. For you, the ordinary Egyptian, the diminishing presence of scribes and written records meant a profound shift in how information was disseminated, how laws were remembered, and how history itself was preserved. The reliable certainty of the written word was replaced by the shifting sands of oral tradition, making knowledge fragile and easily lost. Imagine trying to navigate a world where the very systems that ensured fairness and order were breaking down. In the Old Kingdom, legal disputes, land ownership, and even family genealogies were meticulously recorded on papyrus or inscribed on tomb walls. These records were often consulted to resolve conflicts or confirm rights. Now, with scribes dispersed and access to writing materials severely limited, such formal documentation became rare, if not impossible. Property disputes, for example, would devolve into arguments based on memory and tradition, easily manipulated by the most powerful or persuasive individual. Without written decrees from a central authority, the law would become whatever the local nomarch or strongman decided it was, leading to arbitrary justice and increased insecurity for the common person. The most visible sign of this decline was the near cessation of monumental inscriptions. The grand temples and tombs of the Old Kingdom were covered in hieroglyphic texts, historical annals, religious spells, and biographical accounts. These inscriptions served not just as decoration, but as a permanent record, a testament to the pharaoh's power and the nobles' achievements. During the first intermediate period, this elaborate form of public record-keeping largely disappeared. Nomarchs might commission modest inscriptions for their own tombs, but these were far less numerous, less detailed, and often stylistically inferior to their Old Kingdom predecessors. The sheer effort and resources required for such work were simply unavailable. This meant that the official history, the grand narrative of Egypt, was no longer being continuously recorded and preserved. Oral tradition, which had always existed alongside writing, became increasingly dominant. Stories, of past pharaohs, epic events, and religious myths would be passed down by word of mouth, from elders to children, from bards to audiences. While vibrant and essential for cultural memory, oral traditions are inherently mutable. Details can shift, events can be exaggerated or forgotten, and narratives can be reshaped to suit the needs of the present. For you, this meant that the truth of history became fluid, subject to interpretation and regional variations. The loss of centralized scribal training also impacted technical knowledge. The Old Kingdom had developed sophisticated understanding in areas like engineering for pyramid building and irrigation, medicine and astronomy. This knowledge was often codified in specialized texts. As the institutions that housed and taught these texts faltered, the transmission of this expertise became severely hampered. Future generations would have to rediscover or reinvent knowledge that had once been systematically preserved. Imagine trying to build or repair a complex irrigation system without detailed plans, relying only on fragmented memories and local lore. The efficiency and scale of past projects would become impossible to replicate. Even the religious texts faced challenges. While some important texts, like the coffin texts, which offered a more democratized path to the afterlife, emerged and proliferated, their spread was largely facilitated by individual initiative and local patronage rather than centralized state control. The vast libraries of sacred scrolls held in temples might have suffered from neglect, decay, or even destruction during periods of conflict and famine. The proper performance of religious rituals, which often required precise textual knowledge, might have become difficult, further contributing to the crisis of faith. The scarcity of script and the reliance on oral tradition meant that regional dialects, once more uniform due to centralized administration, would have become more pronounced. Communication between distant nomes, already hampered by insecure trade routes and political fragmentation, would become even more challenging without a common, consistent written language. The very linguistic unity of Egypt, subtly reinforced by the omnipresence of writing, was slowly eroding. The image of a scribe, once a symbol of stability and order, became increasingly rare, a ghostly echo of a bygone era. Their skills, once essential for the functioning of society, were now largely confined to the struggling courts of the powerful nomarchs, or employed in desperate personal attempts to secure an afterlife. The first intermediate period was a time when knowledge itself was a luxury, easily lost in the dust of a collapsing civilization. What would it take for Egypt to once again value the written word? And how would this lost knowledge be painfully rediscovered and rebuilt? The scar of forgetting and the seeds of rebirth, asterisk. The gradual disappearance of scribes and the degradation of written records during the first intermediate period left a profound and lasting scar on Egyptian civilization. For you, the common Egyptian, this age of forgetting meant living in a world increasingly cut off from its own past, where the precise knowledge that had once defined a highly organized society was slowly dissolving into rumor and local legend. Yet, out of this very crisis, the necessity for a renewed emphasis on literacy and documentation would eventually emerge, paving the way for the intellectual revival of the Middle Kingdom. The most significant, long-term consequence was the fragmentation of knowledge. While some scribal traditions would have persisted in the isolated courts of powerful nomarchs, the standardized curriculum and centralized libraries of the Old Kingdom were gone. This meant that technical, administrative, and even religious texts were no longer systematically copied, stored, and disseminated across the entire land. What was known in one nome might be completely lost or misinterpreted in another. Imagine a complex medical procedure or an efficient irrigation technique. Without consistent written records, its efficacy would depend on the fading memories of a few. Rather than a codified body of knowledge, the very language itself began to subtly shift. While hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts remained the basis, regional dialects, no longer standardized by a powerful central bureaucracy, would have become more pronounced. This made communication, already difficult due to political fragmentation and insecure travel, even more challenging. The elegance and precision of Old Kingdom Egyptian, as preserved in its monumental texts, would have given way to more colloquial forms, signaling a linguistic as well as political decentralization. However, the necessity of the written word, though diminished, never entirely vanished. Even in the chaos, local administrators, often the nomarchs themselves or their close kin, would have needed some form of record-keeping to manage their limited resources, collect taxes, and conduct local affairs. This practical need would have kept a small flame of scribal literacy alive, albeit on a much smaller, localized scale. The development and proliferation of the coffin texts during this period is a testament to this underlying demand. These personal funerary spells, offering a more direct path to the afterlife, show that while grand state-sponsored texts dwindled, individual desire for written magic and divine protection persisted, filling the void left by a failing pharaoh. The eventual reunification of Egypt under the Theban 11th dynasty would immediately highlight the profound need to rebuild the scribal class and restore the flow of information. The new pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom understood that to effectively govern a vast, unified land, they needed to resurrect the administrative precision of the Old Kingdom. This meant re-establishing scribal schools, encouraging the copying and preservation of ancient texts, and revitalizing the bureaucracy. The scribes who survived the first intermediate period, or their immediate descendants, would become invaluable. Their knowledge of the old ways, painstakingly pieced back together. The lost scribes of the first intermediate period serve as a sobering reminder of how vulnerable intellectual capital is to societal collapse. A civilization's accumulated wisdom, its history, laws, and religious practices are not just preserved in stone, but in the continuous effort of those who write, read, and interpret them. When that chain of transmission is broken, even for a few generations, the impact can be profound. The scarcity of papyrus and the empty stomachs of potential students were not just material concerns. They were existential threats to Egypt's cultural memory. Yet, the ultimate outcome was a testament to Egyptian resilience. The memory of forgetting spurred a renewed appreciation for the written word in the Middle Kingdom. The chaos underscored the crucial role of the scribe in maintaining order, preserving identity, and connecting the present to the past. The first intermediate period, for all its darkness, ultimately forged a deeper understanding of the indispensable link between a thriving state and a flourishing culture of literacy. The cult of the dead king, maintaining order in chaos, the phantom pharaoh, and a pious illusion. In the stable centuries of the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was a living god, the embodiment of Horus, whose divine presence guaranteed the very cosmic order known as Mat. His death was not an end, but a transition, a joining with Osiris and Re, from whom he continued to intercede for Egypt from the afterlife. This belief formed the bedrock of the royal mortuary cults, elaborate systems of priests, endowments, and rituals designed to perpetually sustain the dead king in his tomb and ensure his continued beneficence for the land. But as Egypt spiraled into the first intermediate period, with famine rampant and central authority fractured. These vital cults faced a profound crisis. For you, the common Egyptian, the maintenance of the cult of the dead king became a desperate, often illusory, attempt to cling to a semblance of order in a world gone mad. A ghost of past stability in a land consumed by chaos. Imagine your life during the Old Kingdom, shaped by the pervasive belief in the pharaoh's divine power, both living and dead. You understood that the prosperity of Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile, and the stability of society were all linked to the well-being of the king, even in his eternal slumber. The pyramids of Giza, Saqqara, and Darsha were not just tombs. They were massive cult centers, each with its own mortuary temple, vast estates, and thousands of priests, scribes, and administrators dedicated solely to providing offerings and performing rituals for the deceased pharaoh. This mortuary industry was a colossal economic engine, employing a significant portion of the population and consuming immense resources. You, a farmer, would contribute a portion of your harvest to these endowments. A craftsman might be conscripted to work on a temple or tomb. It was all part of the sacred compact, ensuring the flow of blessings from the divine realm. However, as the famine deepened and the pharaoh's power waned, the ability to sustain these vast and expensive cults diminished drastically. The endowments, typically in the form of agricultural lands whose produce supported the priests, would have become unproductive due to low Nile floods. The grain in their granaries, once ample, would dwindle. The priests, who were dependent on these provisions, would themselves face starvation. This was not a slow decline. It was a rapid, brutal collapse of a centuries-old system. The first sign of this decline was the abandonment of the cults. Priests, facing hunger and lacking resources, would simply leave their posts. Why stay to perform rituals for a long dead king when your living family was starving? The elaborate daily offerings of food, drink, and incense would cease. The temple complexes, once bustling with activity, would become desolate, their courtyards empty, their altars bare. The very notion of providing for the deceased pharaoh in perpetuity became an impossible burden. This abandonment had profound theological implications. If the living pharaoh was failing to secure mat, and the dead pharaohs were no longer being sustained in the afterlife, then the entire cosmic order was at risk. The belief that the dead king continued to intercede for Egypt was challenged by the grim reality on the ground. For you, the common person, the pharaoh's divine role, both living and dead, was profoundly questioned. The image of a powerful, benevolent, deceased king, once a source of comfort and stability, became a phantom, powerless against the chaos engulfing the land. Yet, despite the undeniable collapse, some communities, particularly those near the older, more revered pyramid complexes, attempted to maintain some semblance of the royal mortuary cults. This wasn't because the pharaoh still held sway, but because the ritual continuity, however meager, offered a psychological lifeline. It was a desperate attempt to invoke the blessings of a powerful past, a plea to the ancient dead kings to somehow restore order to a world in turmoil. These efforts, largely local and often severely diminished, were a testament to the deep-seated cultural memory of the Old Kingdom's glory. Imagine a small, impoverished community trying to scrape together a meager offering for Khufu or Pepe II, knowing full well that their own families were starving. This was not a show of loyalty to a living king, but a desperate act of faith, a clinging to the vestiges of a belief system that had once promised order and abundance. The cult of the dead king, once a vibrant, well-funded institution, became a ghost of its former self, a pious illusion maintained by those who longed for a stability that was no more. What would be the ultimate cost of this desperate illusion? And how would this clinging to the past affect Egypt's ability to forge a new future? The desecrated tombs and the lost offerings asterisk as the first intermediate periods spiraled further into chaos. The desperate, often futile, attempts to maintain the cult of the dead king gave way to a far grimmer reality. The desecration of the very tombs meant to secure eternal life. For you, the common Egyptian, this meant witnessing the ultimate betrayal of sacred space. A chilling demonstration that neither divine power nor elaborate curses could protect. Against the primal forces of hunger and lawlessness, the carefully constructed bridge between the living and the dead was crumbling, and the reverence for the past was sacrificed at the altar of immediate survival. Imagine the horror and despair that would grip a community witnessing such acts. For centuries, tomb robbery was considered one of the most heinous crimes, punishable by severe penalties, including impalement. The elaborate curses inscribed on tomb walls were believed to unleash divine wrath upon intruders. But as the pharaoh's authority vanished and the central government disintegrated, the fear of earthly punishment and even divine retribution significantly diminished. When stomachs growled and families starved, the allure of hidden wealth within ancient tombs became an irresistible, albeit terrifying, prospect. The once sacred mortuary temples and pyramid complexes at Saqqara and other necropolises became targets. These sites, initially protected by royal guards and the pervasive dread of sacrilege, were now vulnerable. Desperate individuals, or even organized gangs operating under the loose protection of local nomarchs, would breach the meticulously sealed entrances. Their goal was simple: to find any valuable grave goods that could be bartered for food, water, or safety. The gold jewelry, precious stones, bronze tools, fine linens, and even the wooden coffins themselves held immense value in a contracting economy. The acts of desecration were often brutal. Mummies, once carefully preserved for eternity, were stripped of their wrappings and ornaments, often dismembered in the frantic search for hidden valuables. Coffins were smashed. Canopic jars containing the deceased's internal organs were shattered, and funerary offerings were plundered. The beautiful reliefs and paintings on tomb walls, which depicted scenes of the deceased's life and ensured their sustenance in the afterlife, would be damaged or defaced in the chaos. For you, the common person, seeing such destruction was a profound shock to your worldview. It signified that the dead, once seemingly eternal, were now as vulnerable as the living. The loss of offerings was equally devastating. The entire cult of the dead king revolved around the daily presentation of food, drink, and incense to the deceased, ensuring their continued existence and their ability to intercede for the living. When the endowments supporting the funerary priests dried up, and the priests themselves abandoned their duties to find sustenance, these vital offerings ceased. The physical act of giving sustenance to the dead was no longer possible. This cessation of offerings, combined with the widespread tomb robbery, had profound spiritual implications. If the deceased pharaohs were no longer being nourished, and their eternal resting places were violated, then their ability to maintain Mat and bless Egypt from the afterlife was severely compromised, if not entirely broken. This contributed to a deeper spiritual crisis among the populace, feeding the belief that the gods and the pharaohs had truly abandoned Egypt. The very fabric of religious belief, woven around the sanctity of the afterlife and the power of the deceased king, began to unravel. The archaeological record of the first intermediate period provides grim evidence of this. Tombs from earlier dynasties show clear signs of violent entry and systematic looting. The quality of burials for ordinary people also declined drastically, reflecting the lack of resources and the diminished emphasis on elaborate funerary rituals. Bodies were often simply interred in shallow graves, sometimes without proper preparation or grave goods. The cult of the dead king, once the engine of the Old Kingdom's monumental efforts, became a casualty of its collapse. Its grand temples lay abandoned, its endowments plundered, and its sacred rituals forgotten. The desecrated tombs stood as stark reminders that in a time of ultimate scarcity, the needs of the living would always, brutally, eclipse the solemn. Obligations to the dead. What would this profound rupture with the past mean for Egypt's understanding of eternity? And how would a new future deal with the haunting legacy of these violated sacred spaces? The reconstruction of piety and the new afterlife asterisk. The devastation wrought upon the cult of the dead king during the first intermediate period left a profound and lasting scar on Egyptian society. For you, the common Egyptian, the sight of desecrated tombs and abandoned temples was a visceral reminder that even the most sacred traditions were vulnerable to chaos. Yet, this very destruction, born from the depths of despair, paradoxically became the catalyst for a radical redefinition of piety and the democratization of the afterlife, paving the way for the spiritual resilience of the Middle Kingdom. The most significant long-term consequence was the democratization of the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, access to eternal life was largely contingent on a close association with the pharaoh, whose divine ascent theoretically pulled his favored nobles and officials into eternity with him. The violation of royal and noble tombs shattered this hierarchical path. If even the great kings and their elite courtiers could not secure their eternal repose, then the old system was broken. This crisis forced people to seek new, more personal avenues to the afterlife. This shift is profoundly reflected in the emergence and widespread use of the coffin texts. These collections of spells, incantations, and divine offerings, once primarily found inscribed in the royal pyramids, now appeared on the wooden coffins of private individuals, even those of modest means. For you, this meant that the path to eternity was no longer the exclusive domain of the pharaoh or the wealthy elite. By acquiring a coffin with these spells, or by knowing key incantations, you could, in theory, bypass the broken royal cult and directly access the divine realm, ensuring your own resurrection and sustenance in the afterlife. This was a direct response to the failings of the old system, a spiritual empowerment born out of necessity. The concept of Marat, cosmic order, also underwent a subtle transformation. While still foundational, the emphasis shifted from the pharaoh as its sole guarantor to a more personal responsibility for upholding moral principles. If the pharaoh could no longer ensure blessings through his mortuary cult, then individual, righteous conduct became increasingly important for one's spiritual well-being. This more personal piety allowed individuals to maintain a sense of order and meaning even in a world that seemed utterly chaotic. The very acts of tomb robbery, while destructive, ironically played a role in this democratization. As grand, protected tombs became a thing of the past, the focus shifted to more modest, less ostentatious burials. The resources that once went into colossal monuments were no longer available, forcing a more practical approach to funerary practices. This simplification, however, did not diminish the core belief in the afterlife, but adapted it. to the harsh realities of the era. When reunification finally came with the rise of the Middle Kingdom, the new pharaohs understood that they could not simply revert to the old kingdom's model of divine kingship and its mortuary cults. The memory of the desecrated tombs and the shattered faith was too strong. While mortuary temples would be built again and royal burials would resume, there was a greater emphasis on the pharaoh as a benevolent shepherd of his people, a more accessible figure who shared in their struggles. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs would often be depicted as strong leaders, but also as empathetic, reflecting the lessons learned from a period where the divine king seemed absent or uncaring. The cult of the dead king, therefore, underwent a traumatic but ultimately transformative experience. Its collapse forced a profound shift in Egyptian religious thought, decentralizing access to the afterlife and fostering a more personal relationship with the divine. The empty and violated tombs of Saqqara, while a haunting testament to a broken past, ultimately represent the crucible in which new forms of piety and new hopes for eternity were forged, proving that even in the face of utter destruction, a civilization's deepest beliefs can adapt and endure. The rise of the Theban Mentuhoteps, the long road to reunification, the southern seed, and the first stirrings of unity, as Egypt lay fractured and bleeding through the long centuries of the first intermediate period. The notion of a unified kingdom, once the bedrock of its identity, seemed a distant, unattainable dream. While the Heracleopolitan pharaohs struggled to maintain a precarious hold over parts of Lower and Middle Egypt from their northern capital, far to the south, in the provincial city of Thebes, a new power was quietly, yet inexorably, rising. This was not a reassertion of the old Memphite authority, but a fresh, pragmatic force born from the very chaos of the age. For you, the common Egyptian, suffering under fragmented rule, the growing whispers from Thebes might have initially seemed just another local ambition, but they would ultimately represent the flickering hope of reunification and the promise of a return to order. Thebes, in Upper Egypt, was a relatively minor provincial center during the Old Kingdom. Unlike the ancient administrative hubs like Memphis or Abydos, it lacked a long history of pharaonic patronage or a vast, established bureaucracy. Its rise was therefore not a return to a former glory, but a genuine ascension born of opportunity and strategic advantage during the period of breakdown. This unassuming city, nestled in a bend of the Nile, would become the launching pad for a new dynasty that would eventually forge the Middle Kingdom from the ashes of the old. The nomarchs of Thebes, the early rulers of the 11th dynasty, possessed several crucial advantages that allowed them to consolidate power more effectively than their northern counterparts. Firstly, their geographical location in Upper Egypt was key. While Lower and Middle Egypt were constantly embroiled in local conflicts and suffering from the most severe impacts of the low Nile floods, Upper Egypt, particularly the southern regions, often experienced slightly more consistent, though still diminished, inundations. This provided a relatively more stable agricultural base from which to draw resources. Secondly, Thebes sat at a vital crossroads for trade routes. It controlled access to the gold mines of Nubia to the south and the Red Sea routes to the east, which provided access to valuable commodities that were becoming increasingly scarce in the fragmented north. This control over trade allowed the Theban nomarchs to accumulate wealth, which they could then use to feed their populations, fund their emerging administration, and, crucially, equip their nascent military forces. The early Theban rulers, like Intef I and Intef II, were not immediately concerned with conquering all of Egypt. Their initial focus was on consolidating their control over the southern nomes, uniting Upper Egypt under their banner. They were, in essence, behaving much like the other powerful nomarchs, but with greater foresight and strategic acumen. They would expand their influence through a combination of diplomacy, strategic alliances, and direct military action against weaker neighbors. For you, living in a province bordering Thebes, this would mean a direct exposure to their growing power, perhaps seeing their well-organized soldiers, or hearing about their successes in bringing recalcitrant nomarchs under their sway. The loyalty they commanded was often earned through their pragmatic ability to provide some measure of stability and protection, a stark contrast to the distant and ineffective Heracleopolitan rule. Unlike the Heracleopolitan pharaohs who clung to the legacy of the Old Kingdom and sought to restore it wholesale, the Thebans embodied a more pragmatic and adaptable leadership. They recognized the need for a new kind of kingship, one that was strong and centralized, yet also understood the importance of regional power and loyalty. They didn't just claim divine right, they demonstrated their competence through effective governance, resource management, and military strength. This was a king who actively fought for his people, rather than simply demanding allegiance based on ancient titles. The rise of the Theban nomarchs also coincided with a subtle shift in religious focus. While the great national gods like Ari and Ptah remained important, the local deity of Thebes, Amen, began to gain prominence. This regional religious identity would grow alongside Theban political power, eventually making Amen one of Egypt's most powerful gods in later periods. For you, struggling in a fragmented Egypt, the whispers from Thebes would have carried a different tone. They weren't just cries of desperation, but increasingly reports of success. Here was a power that was growing, that was winning, that was unifying territory, even if only in the south. It offered a tangible alternative to the endless conflict and stagnation that plagued the north. This emerging southern power, with its fresh approach to leadership and its growing military might, would eventually challenge the Heracleopolitan dynasty, setting the stage for the dramatic showdown that would decide the fate of Egypt's reunification. What would happen when these two visions of Egypt, the old guard clinging to a fading past, and the new power forging a future from the south, finally collided, consolidating the south and eyeing the north asterisk with their foundations firmly laid in Upper Egypt. The Theban Mentuhoteps, particularly under the astute leadership of Intef II and his successors, began to systematically consolidate their power. For you, living under their burgeoning authority in the south, this period brought a rare, almost forgotten sensation, a growing sense of stability and predictable governance, while the north remained a patchwork of warring nomarchs and a struggling Heracleopolitan dynasty. Thebes was actively building a cohesive, unified state, piece by piece. Imagine the contrast. While your counterparts in the Delta might be dodging skirmishes between petty warlords or suffering under the ineffective rule of the Heracleopolitan kings, you might have witnessed the Thebans actually solving problems. Their control over the gold mines of Nubia provided a consistent source of wealth, allowing them to fund their administration and military even when agricultural yields were uncertain. This economic stability, coupled with their often more reliable local Nile floods, meant they could invest in essential infrastructure, maintaining irrigation canals, restocking granaries, and ensuring a more consistent food supply for their growing population. This tangible ability to provide for their people was a powerful source of legitimacy, far more effective than any ancient title. The Thebans also understood the importance of organized military power. Unlike the hastily assembled militias of other nomarchs, the Theban army became increasingly professional and disciplined. They utilized local Upper Egyptian recruits, but also integrated skilled Nubian mercenaries, known for their archery prowess. This strong, centralized military allowed the Thebans to systematically bring the remaining independent nomarchs of Upper Egypt under their control. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for unification. Their campaigns were often strategically planned, aiming to secure vital resources and transportation routes along the Nile, rather than just engaging in random skirmishes. You might have seen their forces moving with purpose along the river, a stark contrast to the scattered, desperate bands in the north. As they expanded their dominion, the Theban pharaohs skillfully integrated the conquered nomes into their growing state. Instead of simply subjugating them, they often sought to incorporate local officials into their administration, creating a new bureaucracy loyal to Thebes. They invested in the local cults of conquered regions, demonstrating respect for regional identities while subtly linking them to the rising power of Amun, Thebes' patron deity. This blend of military might and shrewd political integration allowed them to build a genuinely unified and well-managed southern kingdom, with Upper Egypt largely under their control. The focus of the Theban Mentuhoteps inevitably shifted north. The conflict with the Heracleopolitan dynasty was no longer just a regional dispute. It was a full-blown civil war for the right to rule all of Egypt. The long road to reunification was precisely that, a protracted, bloody struggle. The Heracleopolitan pharaohs, despite their efforts to maintain a semblance of the old kingdom's glory, were increasingly on the defensive. Their resources were dwindling, their control over their own nomarchs was tenuous, and their attempts to reassert authority were often undermined by internal strife. The Theban rulers, particularly Mentuhotep II, understood that this was a war not just of arms, but of ideology. They presented themselves not merely as powerful nomarchs, but as the true restorers of Mat, the legitimate inheritors of the unified Egyptian tradition. Their growing success in the south lent weight to this claim. For you, living in the north, the coming conflict would have been terrifying. The Thebans represented a strong, disciplined force, but also a formidable opponent. The final clash would be brutal, forcing Egypt to endure one last, agonizing struggle before the possibility of peace could finally emerge. The consolidation of Upper Egypt by the Mentuhoteps was a testament to their resilience, foresight, and adaptability. They learned from the failures of the Old Kingdom and the struggles of Heracleopolis, forging a new model of leadership that combined military strength with effective administration. This period of southern unity set the stage for the dramatic confrontation that would define the end of the First Intermediate period and usher in a new era for Egypt. What would be the cost of this final, unifying war, and how would the ultimate victor shape the reborn Egyptian state? The triumph of Thebes and the birth of the Middle Kingdom *, the long, bloody standoff between the Heracleopolitan dynasty in the north and the rising power of Thebes in the south, culminated in a decisive confrontation that would forever reshape the destiny of Egypt. For you, the common Egyptian, this final, unifying war, however brutal, would eventually bring the promise of a peace and stability unseen for generations. The long road to reunification was precisely that, a harrowing journey through civil war, ultimately led by the ambitious and determined Theban pharaoh, Mentuhotep II. Imagine the climax of this protracted struggle. Thebes, having consolidated its control over Upper Egypt, was now poised to challenge the Heracleopolitan heartland directly. The final campaigns would have been relentless, pushing northward along the Nile, overcoming fortified garrisons and routing Heracleopolitan forces. Historical records, though fragmented, hint at key battles and sieges, such as the capture of Abydos, a crucial northern stronghold. The conflict was not just a military one. It was an ideological clash between an old dynasty clinging to a fading legacy and a new power offering a fresh vision for a unified Egypt. The decisive victory came under Mentuhotep II, arguably the true founder of the Middle Kingdom. His forces ultimately defeated the last Heracleopolitan pharaoh, likely Mentuhotep III or a subsequent ruler, around the 11th year of Mentuhotep II's reign circa 2040 BC. The means of their victory, whether through a final, overwhelming battle, the capture of Heracleopolis itself, or the collapse of the northern dynasty from internal pressures, are debated by historians, but the outcome was unequivocal. Egypt was once again united under a single ruler. The reunification, however, was not simply a return to the old kingdom. The centuries of fragmentation had left deep scars. The nomarchs, who had asserted their independence during the chaos, remained powerful entities. Mentuhotep II and his successors understood that outright elimination of these local lords was neither practical nor desirable. Instead, they adopted a more nuanced approach, integrating the nomarchs into the newly centralized state. While their autonomy was curtailed, their positions often remained hereditary, and they continued to play vital roles in provincial administration, albeit under the watchful eye of the pharaoh. This new balance of power would define much of the Middle Kingdom's governance. The capital of the newly reunified Egypt was firmly established at Thebes. This marked a profound shift from the ancient power base of Memphis, signifying a new era and a new source of authority. Thebes, once a provincial town, would rapidly grow into a magnificent city, becoming a major political and religious center, particularly with the ascendance of its local deity, Amen, who would eventually rise to become one of Egypt's most powerful gods. Mentuhotep II's reign, particularly after reunification, was characterized by a period of intensive rebuilding and reorganization. He launched ambitious building projects, most famously his unique funerary complex at Deir el-Bahari, which blended elements of traditional Old Kingdom architecture with innovative new designs. This monumental work symbolized the rebirth of Egypt, a clear statement that the long period of chaos was over. He also focused on restoring the administrative bureaucracy, revitalizing irrigation systems, and re-establishing secure trade routes, particularly to Nubia, which ensured a steady flow of essential resources. For you, the common Egyptian, the triumph of Thebes brought a profound, if gradual, relief. The constant warfare would cease, allowing for more predictable agricultural cycles and the possibility of stable trade. While life would remain challenging, the return of a unified government meant the promise of order, justice, and security. The pharaoh, now residing in Thebes, was no longer a distant, ineffectual figure, but a tangible, powerful ruler who demonstrated his ability to restore Mat through concrete actions. The first intermediate period, born from the failures of the Old Kingdom, culminated in the hard-won reunification achieved by the Theban Mentuhoteps. This era of chaos, famine, and civil war, though devastating, ultimately served as a crucible for Egyptian civilization. It forged a new understanding of kingship, one that valued practical governance alongside divine mandate. It revealed the incredible resilience of the Egyptian people and their enduring desire for unity. The scars of the first intermediate period would remain, but the triumph of Thebes marked the beginning of a vibrant new chapter in Egypt's long and illustrious history, the flourishing Middle Kingdom.